Elizabeth Lizzie Hartman had been at the disaster relief camp for 3 weeks, and nobody really noticed her. At 68, with silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, she blended into the background of the bustling emergency operations center. To everyone around her, she was just another volunteer, the kind grandmother who handed out water bottles and helped with medical supplies. The massive flooding that had devastated the southern border region had displaced thousands of families. The military had set up emergency relief operations, and Lizzie had quietly signed up as a medical volunteer. She worked long hours without complaint, organizing bandages, checking on elderly evacuees, and making sure children had snacks. When people asked about her background, she'd just smile and say, "Oh, I used to work for the government." What they didn't know was that Elizabeth Hartman was a former combat helicopter pilot with over 4 decades of military service. She had flown through sandstorms in Afghanistan that could strip paint off metal, navigated mountain passes in Iraq where one wrong move meant a 1,000-foot drop, and evacuated wounded soldiers while enemy fire lit up the night sky around her. She had completed 2 classified NATO humanitarian missions and earned a call sign that made veteran pilots straighten their shoulders, Valkyrie 1. But after retiring 5 years ago, Lizzie had chosen silence. She'd moved to a quiet town near her old airbase, tended a small garden, and volunteered at the local library. The truth about her past stayed buried beneath her humble exterior until disaster struck. She was assigned to Forward Operating Base Delta, working alongside soldiers young enough to be her grandchildren. They called her Grandma Lizzie with genuine affection, though some quietly joked about her slow walk and the way she always seemed to know exactly where every piece of equipment was located. Private Jason Miller, a 19-year-old from Ohio, had started bringing her coffee every morning. "You remind me of my grandmother," he told her with a smile. What Jason and the others didn't see were the subtle signs that gave away her true identity. The way she instinctively checked the wind direction every morning. How her eyes automatically tracked every aircraft that flew overhead. The fact that she never seemed surprised by the sound of helicopters landing, even when they came in hot and fast. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the unit's senior mechanic, had noticed a few things that didn't quite add up. The way Lizzie moved around the base suggested someone familiar with military operations. She never got in the way of ground crews, always seemed to know which areas were off limits, and had an uncanny ability to predict when supplies were running low. "There's something different about that lady," Torres had mentioned to his buddy, Corporal David Rodriguez. "She's not just any volunteer." "What do you mean?" Rodriguez had asked. "Watch her sometime. She doesn't move like a civilian. She moves like someone who's been on bases her whole life." But their casual observations would soon become irrelevant. Because on this particular afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon for the 4th day in a row, a frantic radio call was about to change everything. The emergency radio crackled to life across the camp. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Outpost Charlie. We have 60 personnel stranded at the forward position. Water levels are rising rapidly. Road access is completely cut off. We need immediate air evacuation. I repeat, we need immediate air evacuation." The base's only operational helicopter, a UH-60 Black Hawk, had crashed during a difficult landing just hours earlier. The pilot, Captain Robert Hayes, was unconscious with a severe head wound. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Amanda Foster, had a broken arm and was in no condition to fly. Commander James Patterson's voice boomed across the camp. "Does anyone here have helicopter pilot experience? We need someone who can fly a UH-60 Black Hawk." Complete silence fell over the assembled soldiers and volunteers. 60 people were about to drown, and their only hope sat damaged on the tarmac with no one qualified to fly it. until a quiet voice spoke up from the back of the crowd. "I can fly it." Every head turned. There stood Lizzie, medical kit still, in her hands, looking directly at the damaged aircraft with an expression no one had ever seen on her face before. Those 4 simple words were about to change everything. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Laughter erupted from the crowd, of soldiers like a dam bursting. Private Jason Miller, the same young man who brought Lizzie coffee every morning, couldn't contain himself. "Are you serious right now?" He chuckled, pulling out his phone to record. "Grandma thinks she can fly a Black Hawk." Corporal David Rodriguez whispered loudly to his buddy, "This is gonna be viral, for sure. Maybe she thinks it's like driving her old pickup truck to the grocery store." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back called out, "What's next? Is she gonna tell us she's a Navy SEAL too?" The joke got another round of chuckles. But Lizzie wasn't listening to the mockery. She was already walking toward the aircraft with a purposeful stride that made a few people stop laughing. Something about the way she moved, confident, direct, familiar, didn't match the grandmother they thought they knew. She approached the helicopter like she owned it. Her hands moved across the external inspection points with muscle memory that spoke of thousands of hours of experience. She checked the tail rotor, examined the main rotor hub, and peered into the engine compartment with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. Staff Sergeant Torres watched her movements carefully. His smile faded as recognition dawned. "Wait a minute," he muttered to Rodriguez. "Those movements, that's textbook pre-flight inspection protocol. She's checking everything in the exact right order." "Come on, Torres. You're seeing things," Rodriguez replied. But his voice lacked conviction. Lizzie opened the pilot's door and slid into the left seat. Her hands found every switch, every gauge, every control without hesitation. She adjusted the seat and mirrors with fluid motions that spoke of someone who had sat in that exact position countless times before. The laughter was starting to die down, replaced by confused murmurs. "Battery switch on," Lizzie announced clearly, her voice suddenly crisp and authoritative. "Fuel pumps, check. Engine oil pressure, within limits. Flight controls, free and correct." She was running through the pre-flight checklist with the precision of a seasoned pilot. The transformation was startling. Gone was the quiet grandmother who had been organizing medical supplies just minutes before. In her place sat someone who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. Private Miller lowered his phone, his expression shifting from amusement to uncertainty. "Holy cow," he whispered. "She actually knows what she's doing." Commander Patterson approached the aircraft, his face a mixture of hope and concern. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a $30 million piece of military equipment. I can't just let." Lizzie looked directly at him through the cockpit window. For the first time since anyone had known her, her eyes weren't kind and grandmotherly. They were steel. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made him step back, "I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you that I'm bringing our people home." The change in her demeanor was so complete that several soldiers took involuntary steps backward. This wasn't the same woman who had been handing out granola bars to hungry children an hour ago. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," Patterson said, though his voice had lost its commanding edge. "I need to know who you are. Right now." "I'm the only person on this base who can fly that aircraft," Lizzie replied, continuing her checks. "And there are 60 soldiers who are going to die if we don't get them out of there in the next hour." The GPS navigation system was damaged from the crash. The advanced flight computers were offline. She would be flying with basic instruments, radio communications, and nothing else but her own experience. Private Miller, still recording, captured the moment when the engines began to spin up. The familiar whine filled the air as the rotor blades started their rotation. Several soldiers had to step back from the increasing wind. "Ma'am, what if we get lost out there?" asked Corporal Jennifer Walsh, a young mech who had volunteered to accompany the flight. Lizzie's hands moved across the controls with practiced ease. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice now calm but carrying decades of confidence, "I don't need GPS. I remember every wind pattern, every thermal current, every landmark in this entire region." She keyed the radio. "Rescue base. This is Rescue 1. Requesting clearance for immediate takeoff. 60 souls are counting on us." As the helicopter lifted off the ground, Staff Sergeant Torres pulled out his phone and started frantically searching military databases. What he found made his blood run cold. Elizabeth Lightning Hartman. Call sign Valkyrie 1. Over 4,000 combat flight hours. Recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Military Outstanding Volunteer Service Medal. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a legend. The Black Hawk cut through turbulent air as storm clouds from the previous day's flooding still lingered, creating dangerous wind shears and severely limited visibility. Inside the cockpit, Lizzie's transformation was complete. Gone was the quiet grandmother who had been tending to wounded civilians. In her place sat a combat veteran whose hands moved with the precision of a master craftsman. "Rescue base. This is Rescue 1. She spoke into her headset with calm professionalism. "Flying visual flight rules due to navigation system damage. Estimated time to target, 18 minutes. Corporal Walsh watched in amazement as Lizzie navigated using nothing but landmarks and instinct. No fancy GPS, no computer-assisted flight paths, just pure skill developed over decades of flying in the world's most dangerous places. "Ma'am," Walsh asked, gripping her seat as they hit a particularly rough patch of air, "how do you know exactly where to go?" Lizzie pointed ahead to a distinctive rock formation jutting up from the flooded landscape. "See that ridgeline? I've flown past it 600 times during training exercises. That valley below? I medevaced 12 wounded Rangers from there." In 2018, the helicopter suddenly dropped 20 feet as they hit a severe wind shear. Walsh's stomach lurched, but Lizzie barely moved, smoothly adjusting the controls to compensate. "Every mountain, every river, every tree line," Lizzie continued, her voice steady despite the challenging conditions. "They all tell a story. You just have to know how to listen." As they approached the stranded outpost, the situation became crystal clear through the windscreen. What had been dry land that morning was now almost completely submerged. 60 soldiers stood clustered on the highest ground available, a small patch of earth barely 50 yards across, surrounded by rising floodwater. The men and women below were waving frantically at the approaching helicopter. But there was a serious problem. There was no landing zone. The water was too deep for the aircraft to safely touch down, and the ground that remained was too soft and uneven. Any attempt to land could result in the helicopter tipping over or sinking into the mud. "Rescue 1, this is Captain Rodriguez at the outpost." A desperate voice crackled through the radio. "We can see you, but there's nowhere for you to land. The water's still rising. We've got maybe 15 minutes before this whole area is underwater." Walsh looked at Lizzie with wide eyes. "What do we do now?" Lizzie's response was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "We don't land." She maneuvered the helicopter into a hover just 15 feet above the stranded soldiers. The rotor wash created massive waves in the floodwater below, but she held the aircraft perfectly steady despite the challenging conditions. "Open that side door," Lizzie instructed Walsh. "We're going to do this the old-fashioned way." What happened next was a masterclass in precision flying. For the next 28 minutes, Lizzie held the Black Hawk in a perfect hover while soldiers climbed aboard, using rope ladders and hoist equipment. The aircraft swayed and bucked in the unstable air, but her control inputs were so smooth that most of the evacuees barely felt the movement. One by one, the stranded personnel climbed to safety. The wounded first, then the remaining soldiers. Each time someone new entered the cabin, Lizzie had to adjust for the changing weight and balance calculations she performed instinctively after decades of experience. The last person to board was Captain Rodriguez himself. As he climbed through the door, soaking wet and exhausted, he made his way to the cockpit. "Ma'am," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I thought we were going to die out there. I thought I'd never see my family again." Lizzie's response was simple. "You're safe. Now, son." She keyed the radio one final time. "Rescue base. This is Rescue 1. Package secured. 60 souls aboard, heading home." But their troubles weren't over yet. As they gained altitude for the return flight, a warning light illuminated on the instrument panel. Engine oil pressure was dropping rapidly, likely damage from the earlier crash. They were 15 minutes from base, carrying 60 people, with an engine that might fail at any moment. Back at the base, the footage that Private Miller had captured was already spreading through social media. The video showed an elderly woman calmly walking toward a military helicopter while soldiers laughed and pointed. But the comment section was starting to fill with a different tone. "Wait, is that really happening? Someone find out who this lady is. That's not just some random grandma." Staff Sergeant Torres was frantically making phone calls, trying to verify what he'd found in the military database. When he finally reached someone at the Pentagon who could confirm Lizzie's service record, the conversation was brief. "Sir, we have a situation. Elizabeth Hartman is flying a rescue mission, and I need to know. Valkyrie 1? The voice on the other end interrupted. "If Lightning Hartman is flying that bird, son, those people are in the best hands possible. That woman is a legend." As the damaged helicopter approached the base, Lizzie's calm voice came over the radio. "Rescue base. This is Rescue 1. Be advised, we're showing engine oil pressure issues. Request priority landing and emergency crew standing by." In the cabin behind her, 60 soldiers sat in complete silence. They could feel the vibration in the aircraft, knew something was wrong, but looking at the steady shoulders of their pilot, most felt oddly at peace. The woman they had laughed at just an hour ago was about to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places. The engine warning light pulsed red as they approached the base. Lizzie's eyes scanned the instruments while her hands made minute adjustments to keep the overloaded helicopter stable. The oil pressure was dropping faster. Now they had minutes, maybe less, before complete engine failure. "Rescue base. This is Rescue 1. She transmitted with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the flight. "Be advised, we're showing critical engine oil pressure. Request immediate priority landing and full emergency response." Staff Sergeant Torres was on the radio from the ground, his voice tight with concern. "Rescue 1, we have you in sight. Wind is calm, approach is clear. Bring them home." Through the windscreen, Lizzie could see the base's emergency crew scrambling into position. Fire trucks, ambulances, and ground personnel were all standing by. The entire base had stopped what they were doing to watch the approaching helicopter. In the cabin, Captain Rodriguez moved quietly among his soldiers, checking on the wounded and keeping everyone calm. But even he couldn't hide the tension in his voice when he announced, "We're going in for landing. Everyone brace yourselves." What happened next would be talked about in military aviation circles for years to come. Despite the failing engine, despite carrying twice the helicopter's normal capacity, despite having no advanced navigation systems, Lizzie brought that Black Hawk down in the smoothest landing anyone at the base had ever witnessed. The skids touched the ground so gently that several passengers later said, They didn't even realize they had landed until the engines began winding down. There was no jarring impact, no bounce, no grinding of metal. Just a whisper-soft touchdown that seemed to defy physics. As the rotor blades slowed to a stop, the side doors opened and soldiers began pouring out. Some dropped to their knees and kissed the ground. Others stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just experienced. But the most dramatic moment came when Captain Rodriguez was the last to exit. He walked directly to the pilot's side of the aircraft as Lizzie was completing her post-flight checklist. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I need to know, who are you really?" Lizzie removed her helmet and climbed down from the cockpit. Her silver hair was matted with sweat, her face showing the exhaustion of intense concentration, but her eyes held a quiet satisfaction. "I'm just a volunteer medic," she said with a gentle smile. "But helicopters, well, they shouldn't sit idle when people need help." The crowd that had gathered to watch the landing was completely silent. Private Miller, who had been recording everything, slowly lowered his phone. The same young man who had laughed and called her grandma just 2 hours ago was now staring at her with something approaching awe. Commander Patterson approached her, his expression a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." "I should have, Commander," Lizzie interrupted gently. "You did exactly what you should have done. You questioned an unknown quantity. That's good leadership." She picked up her medical kit and started walking back toward the volunteer quarters. The Torres intercepted her path. "Ma'am, wait," he said, holding up his phone. "I found your service record. Elizabeth Lightning Hartman, call sign Valkyrie 1. Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 bronze stars, over 4,000 combat hours." Lizzie paused, her shoulders tensing slightly. "That was a long time ago, Sergeant." "Ma'am, with respect, it was 5 years ago. And legends don't have expiration dates." The word legend rippled through the crowd. Soldiers who had been joking about Grandma earlier were now looking at her with entirely different eyes. The cell phone footage that Private Miller had captured was already going viral, but now it was being shared with captions like, "68-year-old war hero saves 60 soldiers." And they laughed at her, and she proved them wrong. That night, Lizzie returned to her small cot in the volunteer quarters. She didn't mention the rescue to anyone, didn't post about it on social media, didn't call her friends back home. She simply went back to organizing medical supplies as if nothing had happened. But the story was spreading far beyond the base. The footage had been picked up by news outlets, and military personnel around the world were sharing it with their own stories of Lightning Hartman's legendary flying skills. Private Miller approached her the next morning with her usual cup of coffee, but this time his demeanor was completely different. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I was completely out of line yesterday." Lizzie smiled and accepted the coffee. "Jason, you reacted exactly how any reasonable person would react. An old lady claiming she could fly a military helicopter? That does sound pretty crazy. But you're not just any old lady, are you?" "I'm exactly who I've always been," she replied. "I just don't usually get the chance to fly anymore." That simple statement would soon prove to be prophetic, because word of yesterday's rescue had reached the highest levels of military command, and Elizabeth Hartman was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. 3 days after the rescue, a black SUV pulled up to the volunteer quarters at 0800 hours. 2 men in dress uniforms stepped out, their chests heavy with ribbons and insignia. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb and Major Patricia Hayes had driven 6 hours from Pentagon liaison office to have a conversation with Elizabeth Hartman. Lizzie was in the medical tent, inventory supplies with her usual quiet efficiency, when Commander Patterson appeared with the 2 officers. "Mrs. Hartman," Patterson said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there before. These gentlemen would like to speak with you." Lieutenant Colonel Webb stepped forward, his expression serious but respectful. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Webb from the Department of Defense. We need to discuss your actions 3 days ago." Lizzie set down her clipboard and turned to face them. "Is there a problem, Colonel?" "Ma'am, there are several problems," Webb replied. "First, you flew a military aircraft without proper authorization. Second, you did so without current medical certification or flight physical. Third, you endangered the lives of 60 personnel by operating damaged equipment." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several nearby soldiers and volunteers had stopped what they were doing to listen. "However," Webb continued, "you also saved 60 lives in an operation that our flight simulation experts say was impossible. So we're here to understand exactly who you are and what happened." Major Hayes opened a thick folder. "Elizabeth Hartman, service number 847923156, 42 years of service, retired as lieutenant colonel. Over 4,000 combat flight hours, including classified missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and 2 NATO operations that are still redacted." She looked up from the file. "Ma'am, your service record is impressive, but it's also 5 years old. Current regulations require active medical certification and recurrent training for all military aircraft operations." Lizzie's expression remained calm. "Major, are you suggesting I should have let those soldiers drown while we waited for the paperwork to be processed?" "Ma'am, that's not, because that's exactly what would have happened," Lizzie continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had emerged in the cockpit. "I assessed the situation, determined I was the only qualified pilot available, and acted accordingly. If you want to court-martial a 68-year-old volunteer for saving lives, that's your prerogative." Webb held up a hand. "Ma'am, nobody's talking about court-martial. In fact, we're here to offer you something else entirely." He pulled out a document with official letterhead. "The Department of Defense would like to offer you a consulting position, instructor pilot for advanced rescue operations. Full reinstatement of flight status, appropriate medical waivers, and a salary commensurate with your experience." Lizzie stared at the document for a long moment. "You want me to come back?" "Ma'am, pilots with your experience and skill set are extremely rare. The rescue you performed is being studied by aviation experts worldwide. We could use someone with your abilities. And if I refuse?" Webb's expression grew uncomfortable. "Ma'am, there's still the matter of the unauthorized flight. While we're not pursuing charges, there could be administrative consequences." The threat was subtle but clear. Accept the position or face potential punishment for her actions. "Staff." Sergeant Torres, who had been listening from nearby, stepped forward. "With respect, sir, are you seriously threatening the woman who just saved 60 lives?" "Sergeant, this doesn't concern you," Major Hayes snapped. "Actually, it does," Torres replied. "Because every person on this base saw what happened. We saw you laugh at her, then watch her do the impossible. And now you're trying to strong-arm her into taking a job?" Other soldiers began gathering around. Captain Rodriguez, still at the base for debriefing, joined the group. "Ma'am, if it weren't for you, my soldiers would be dead. If these officers have a problem with that, they can answer to us." Lizzie looked around at the faces surrounding her young soldiers who had gone from mocking her to defending her in the span of a few days. "I appreciate your support," she said quietly, "but I can handle this myself." She turned back to Webb. "Colonel, I spent 42 years following orders. I retired so I could make my own choices. If you want to punish me for saving lives, that's your decision. But I'm not going back to wearing a uniform just because you're afraid of bad publicity." Webb's face flushed red. "Ma'am, you're making a mistake. This offer won't be extended again." "Good," Lizzie replied, "because I wouldn't accept it again." She picked up her clipboard and went back to counting medical supplies, effectively dismissing the two officers. After a moment of awkward silence, they turned and walked away. But as they climbed back into their SUV, Major Hayes made a phone call. "Sir, she refused the offer." "No, sir. She wasn't intimidated by the administrative threat." "Yes, sir. I understand. Proceed with option B." That evening, Lizzie received a call on her personal cell phone. The voice on the other end was familiar General Patricia Morrison, her former commanding officer and one of the few people who knew the full extent of Lizzie's classified missions. "Lightning," Morrison said, using the call sign that few people still remembered. "We need to talk." "General, if this is about the job offer..." "It's not about the job, Lizzie. It's about the investigation they're about to launch into your flight. They're going to question your medical fitness, your mental competency, and your right to make the decisions you made." Lizzie felt a chill run down her spine. "They're going to try to destroy my reputation. They're going to try to make you look like a reckless old woman who got lucky. They want to discredit the rescue so they can avoid questions about why they didn't have qualified pilots available." "What do you suggest, General?" Morrison's voice grew firm. "I suggest you fight back. You've got allies you don't even know about. That footage of your rescue? It's inspired thousands of people. Veterans, active duty, civilians. They're all talking about the woman who stepped up when everyone else stepped back. I just want to go back to my quiet life. I know you do. But sometimes quiet isn't an option. Sometimes you have to stand up and show people what real courage looks like." The next morning, Lizzie woke to find protesters outside the base gates. But they weren't protesting her. They were supporting her. Signs read, "Heroes don't retire," and "Elizabeth Hartman, American legend." The fight was just beginning. 2 weeks after the rescue, the formal investigation began. The Department of Defense had assigned Colonel Richard Hawthorne, a by-the-book officer with a reputation for strict adherence to regulations, to lead the inquiry into what they were now calling the Hartman incident. Lizzie sat in a sterile conference room at the base, facing a panel of 3 officers. Hawthorne presided over the proceedings with the enthusiasm of a man who had found a regulation violation and intended to prosecute it to the fullest extent. "Mrs. Hartman," Hawthorne began, consulting his notes, "you operated a military aircraft without proper authorization, current medical certification, or recent flight training. Do you understand the gravity of these violations?" "Colonel," Lizzie replied calmly, "I understand that 60 soldiers are alive today because of those violations." "That's not the issue here," Hawthorne snapped. "The issue is that you endangered lives by operating equipment you weren't qualified to use. I had over 4,000 flight hours in similar aircraft. 5 years ago, ma'am. Military regulations clearly state that pilots must maintain current proficiency standards. You hadn't flown a military aircraft in 5 years." Captain Rodriguez, who had been called as a witness, leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, I was there. I saw what happened. That woman saved our lives with flying skills I've never seen before." "Captain, your testimony is noted," Hawthorne replied dismissively. "But emotional responses don't change regulatory requirements." The questioning continued for 3 hours. Hawthorne attacked every aspect of Lizzie's decision-making, from her choice to fly without GPS to her decision to hover-load passengers instead of finding a proper landing zone. "Mrs. Hartman, you put 60 lives at risk with your reckless flying. You could have killed them all." "But I didn't," Lizzie replied. "Simply luck, ma'am. Pure luck." That was when Staff Sergeant Torres stood up from his seat in the back of the room. "Sir, permission to speak?" "Sergeant, you're not on the witness list." "Sir, I'm the senior mechanic who inspected that aircraft after the flight. I found something that needs to be part of this record." Hawthorne looked annoyed but gestured for Torres to continue. Sir, when I examined the helicopter after landing, I found that the engine was within 15 seconds of complete failure. The oil pressure had dropped to critical levels, and the engine was running on fumes. He pulled out a maintenance report. According to our analysis, a less experienced pilot would have crashed. The only reason that aircraft landed safely was because Mrs. Hartman compensated for the engine problems with manual control inputs that our flight simulator can't replicate. Sergeant, that's speculation. No, sir, it's not. We ran the flight profile through our computer systems. The simulator crashed every time we tried to replicate the conditions she faced. According to our computers, what she did was impossible. Murmurs rippled through the room. Hawthorne's face reddened. Sergeant, you're dismissed. But Torres wasn't finished. Sir, there's something else. I've been in communication with pilots who served with Mrs. Hartman. They're willing to testify about her abilities. This hearing is about regulatory compliance, not war stories. Sir, they're willing to testify about her classified missions, the ones that are still redacted in her official record. The room fell silent. Hawthorne looked uncomfortable for the first time. Sergeant, classified information is not admissible in administrative hearings. What if it was declassified? Sir. All eyes turned to the back of the room, where General Morrison had quietly entered during the proceedings. General, Hawthorne said, clearly surprised. I wasn't aware you were attending this hearing. I wasn't planning to, Morrison replied, until I heard about the direction this investigation was taking. She walked to the front of the room and placed a thick folder on the table. Colonel Hawthorne, I'm hereby declassifying portions of Lieutenant Colonel Hartman's service record that are directly relevant to this hearing. Hawthorne opened the folder and began reading. As he scanned the pages, his expression changed from confidence to concern to something approaching shock. General, these mission reports, some of these operations, are directly relevant to assessing Lieutenant Colonel Hartman's qualifications, Morrison finished, including the mission where she flew a damaged helicopter through a sandstorm to evacuate casualties from a forward operating base, the mission where she landed on a mountain peak in Afghanistan that was supposedly inaccessible to aircraft, the mission where she flew for 11 hours straight to evacuate wounded soldiers from 3 different locations. She looked directly at Hawthorne. Colonel, you've been questioning her qualifications. I'm here to establish them definitively. Morrison turned to address the room. Elizabeth Hartman didn't just fly helicopters. She redefined what was possible. In military aviation, she has more combat rescue hours than any pilot in the current active roster. She's trained half the instructor pilots currently serving, and she's completed missions that are still classified because they were so far beyond normal operational parameters. Hawthorne was frantically reading through the declassified documents. General, even if these records are accurate, the regulatory violations still stand. Do they, Colonel? Morrison pulled out another document. Emergency Authority Regulation 347-12. In situations where lives are at immediate risk and no other qualified personnel are available, any retired military pilot may resume operational duties at the discretion of the commanding officer. But she wasn't given permission by the commanding officer. Actually, she was. Commander Patterson stood up. I gave verbal authorization for the flight. It's in my official report. Hawthorne looked stunned. Commander, you didn't mention this in your initial statement, because I didn't think I needed. Tell, Patterson replied. A qualified pilot requested permission to conduct a rescue operation. I granted it. End of story. The investigation that was supposed to destroy Lizzie's reputation was falling apart. But the real surprise was yet to come. The hearing room buzzed with tension as Colonel Hawthorne realized his case was crumbling. But he had one more card to play. General Morrison, he said, his voice tight with frustration. Even if the flight was authorized, There's still the matter of Mrs. Hartman's medical certification. She hasn't passed a flight physical in 5 years. Morrison smiled. Colonel, when was the last time you read Emergency Medical Waiver Protocol 234-7? Hawthorne's face went pale. I'm not familiar with that regulation. It states that any pilot with a Distinguished Flying Cross and over 3,000 combat hours can receive emergency medical waivers in life-threatening situations. The waiver can be granted retroactively if the mission was successful and no medical issues were detected. She pulled out yet another document. This is Mrs. Hartman's medical evaluation from yesterday. Dr. Patricia Williams, the base flight surgeon, conducted a complete examination. Would you like to know the results? Dr. Williams stood up from the audience. Mrs. Hartman's physical condition is excellent for her age. Her vision, reflexes, and cognitive function all exceed the minimum standards for military pilots. In fact, her test scores are better than most active duty pilots half her age. The room erupted in murmurs. Hawthorne was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Furthermore, Dr. Williams continued, her psychological evaluation reveals a level of decision-making ability and stress management that I've rarely seen in 30 years of examining pilots. Hawthorne made one last desperate attempt. The regulations clearly state, Colonel, Morrison interrupted, I think we've established that Mrs. Hartman violated no regulations. In fact, I think we've established that she performed one of the most remarkable rescue operations in recent military history. She turned to address the entire room. But there's something else you all need to know. Something that explains why the Department of Defense was so eager to either recruit Mrs. Hartman or discredit her. Morrison pulled out a final folder, this one marked with the highest classification levels. 3 weeks before the flooding disaster, the Pentagon received a report from the Government Accountability Office. The report detailed critical shortages in qualified rescue pilots and questioned whether our current training programs were adequate. She opened the folder. The report specifically mentioned that many of our most experienced pilots had retired, taking decades of institutional knowledge. With them, it recommended immediate action to address these gaps. Hawthorne was now sweating visibly. General, I don't see how this is relevant. It's relevant because Mrs. Hartman's rescue exposed exactly what the Gao report warned about. When the crisis hit, we had no qualified pilots available. Our training had failed, our preparation had failed, and our personnel were about to die. Morrison's voice grew stern. The Department of Defense wasn't trying to punish Mrs. Hartman for regulatory violations. They were trying to cover up their own failures by discrediting the person who had exposed them. The room erupted. Captain Rodriguez stood up, his face flushed with anger. You mean this whole investigation was just to cover their own mistakes? The investigation was designed to make Mrs. Hartman look like a reckless amateur who got lucky. Morrison confirmed. They wanted to shift attention away from the fact that their own policies left soldiers stranded with no rescue capability. Staff Sergeant Torres added, that's why they offered her the consulting job first. They wanted to buy her silence. Morrison nodded. When she refused to be bought, they tried to destroy her credibility. Lizzie, who had remained quiet throughout most of the hearing, finally spoke. General, with respect, I didn't do this for political reasons. I did it because soldiers were going to die. I know that, Lightning. But your actions exposed a system failure that cost taxpayers millions and put lives at risk. Someone had to be held accountable. She looked directly at Hawthorne. Colonel, you spent the last 3 hours trying to prove that Mrs. Hartman was unqualified to fly that rescue mission. But the real question is, why wasn't there a qualified pilot available when the crisis hit? Hawthorne's silence was damning. Morrison continued. The base had 2 qualified pilots. One was unconscious. The other had a broken arm. The nearest backup was 4 hours away. For a disaster relief operation in flood-prone territory, that's inexcusable. Private Miller, who had been watching from the back, raised his hand. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" Morrison nodded. "Ma'am, I was the one who filmed Mrs. Hartman's rescue. The video has been viewed over 3 million times. But what most people don't know is that I also filmed what happened before she volunteered." He pulled out his phone. "I recorded Commander Patterson asking if anyone could fly the helicopter. I recorded the silence. I recorded the desperation in his voice when he realized we had no options." He played the video. The room watched as Patterson's voice cracked with emotion. "Does anyone here have helicopter pilot experience? We need someone who can fly a UH-60 Black Hawk. Please, if anyone has any flight experience at all." The silence that followed was heartbreaking. "That's the real story," Miller continued. "Not that Mrs. Hartman broke regulations, but that she was the only thing standing between 60 soldiers and death." Morrison closed her folders. "Colonel Hawthorne, I think this hearing is over. Mrs. Hartman has been cleared of all regulatory violations. Furthermore, I'm recommending her for a Presidential Unit citation for her actions during the rescue." Hawthorne gathered his papers with shaking hands. "General, I was following orders. Colonel, your orders were to find regulatory violations and build a case for administrative action. You found no violations, and your case has been dismissed. I suggest you report that back to whoever gave you those orders." As the panel disbanded, Lizzie remained seated, processing everything that had just happened. She had come to the hearing expecting to defend her actions. Instead, she had witnessed the exposure of a systemic failure that went far beyond one rescue mission. Captain Rodriguez approached her. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you, not just for saving our lives, but for standing up to this." "Captain, I didn't stand up to anything. I just refused to apologize for doing what was right." Torres joined them. "Ma'am, there's something you should know. That video Private Miller took? It's not just going viral for entertainment. Military families are sharing it. Veterans groups are talking about it. And Congress is asking questions about pilot readiness." Lizzie looked surprised. "I never wanted this kind of attention." "Maybe not," Morrison said, approaching the group. "But sometimes the right person doing the right thing at the right time can change everything." She handed Lizzie an official document. "This isn't a job offer or a request. It's an invitation. The military wants to establish a new program for emergency pilot certification, using your rescue as the model. They want experienced retirees to serve as backup pilots for disaster relief operations." Lizzie read the document carefully. "This would mean other retirees could do what I did without facing investigation?" "Exactly. And it would mean we'd never again have soldiers stranded because we lack qualified pilots." For the first time since the hearing began, Lizzie smiled. "General, where do I sign?" 6 months later, Elizabeth Hartman stood in the Pentagon briefing room, addressing a group of newly certified emergency response pilots. At 68, she had become the face of a revolutionary program that paired retired military aviators with active disaster relief operations. "The most important thing to remember," she told the group of 20 retired pilots, "is that your experience didn't expire when you took off your uniform. It's still there, waiting for the moment when lives depend on it." In the audience sat Captain Rodriguez, now fully recovered and serving as a program liaison. Staff Sergeant Torres had been promoted and was helping to develop the technical standards for the emergency certification process. Even Private Miller was there, having transferred to public affairs and documenting the program's success. The Hartman Protocol, as it had come to be known, had already been activated 12 times in different disaster zones across the country. Retired pilots had conducted rescue operations during hurricanes, forest fires, and flooding events, saving hundreds of lives that might otherwise have been lost while waiting for active duty crews to arrive. But the program's impact went beyond just rescue operations. It had sparked a national conversation about how society treats its aging population and the value of experience over bureaucracy. Mrs. Hartman asked a reporter from Military Times, "How does it feel to know that your single act of courage has changed military policy?" Lizzie smiled. "I didn't set out to change anything. I just saw people who needed help and knew I had the skills to help them. The policy changes are nice, but the real victory is that we won't have soldiers stranded again because of bureaucratic gaps." The ceremony concluded with the presentation of the Presidential Unit citation that General Morrison had recommended. President Williams himself made the presentation, calling Lizzie's rescue an example of American courage and competence that transcends age, gender, and bureaucracy. After the ceremony, Lizzie found herself surrounded by young pilots seeking advice and older veterans asking about joining the program. But the conversation that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Colonel Hawthorne approached her quietly, away from the crowd. "Mrs. Hartman," he said, his voice subdued, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about what happened." Lizzie studied his face. "Colonel, you were doing your job as you understood it." "No, ma'am, I wasn't. I was covering up institutional failures by attacking the person who exposed them. That's not leadership, it's cowardice." He handed her a letter. "I've submitted my resignation from the investigative division. I'm requesting transfer to the emergency response program. I want to help fix the problems instead of hiding them." Lizzie read the letter, then looked back at Hawthorne. "Colonel, everyone deserves a chance to do better. But this program isn't about redemption, it's about service. If you're serious about helping, you'll have to prove it." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." As the reception wound down, Lizzie stepped outside onto the Pentagon's terrace. The Washington skyline stretched before her, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopters conducting training exercises. General Morrison joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts, Lightning?" Lizzie accepted the coffee. "I keep thinking about those 60 soldiers. How close we came to losing them because nobody thought to ask if there were qualified people available who just happened to be retired." "You did more than save those soldiers," Morrison said. "You changed how we think about human resources. Age isn't disqualification. It's often qualification." The funny thing is, Lizzie reflected, I really was content with my quiet retirement. I had no desire to get back into military life. But when the moment came, you stepped forward. When people need help, you help them. It's not complicated. Morrison smiled. "That's what makes you special, Lightning. You make the extraordinary seem ordinary." A young pilot approached them, Lieutenant Rebecca Walsh, Corporal Walsh's younger sister, who had been inspired by the rescue to pursue helicopter training. "Mrs. Hartman," she said, "I graduate from flight school next month. I wanted to thank you for showing me that pilots can be heroes at any age." Lizzie shook her hand. "Lieutenant, you don't need me to show you how to be a hero. You just need to be ready when the moment calls. Will you be there for my graduation?" "I wouldn't miss it." As they walked back toward the building, Morrison asked, "Any regrets about how this all turned out?" Lizzie thought for a moment. "Just one. I wish those young soldiers hadn't laughed when I volunteered to fly. Not because it hurt my feelings, but because it showed they'd been taught that help only comes from expected places. And now? Now they know better. Help can come from anywhere, at any time, from anyone willing to step forward." 6 months later, when Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, 5 retired pilots operating under the Hartman Protocol conducted rescue operations that saved over 200 lives. One of those pilots was a 72-year-old grandmother from Nebraska who had flown transport missions in Vietnam. When reporters asked her about following in Elizabeth Hartman's footsteps, she smiled and said, "I'm not following anyone's footsteps. I'm just doing what needs to be done." The video of her rescue went viral with a simple caption. They said she was too old to fly. She brought home 47 people. Because sometimes the most extraordinary heroes are hiding in the most ordinary places, waiting for the moment when the world needs them to say those 4 simple words, "I can fly it." And in a quiet town near an old airbase, Elizabeth Hartman tends her garden and volunteers at the library, always ready for the next call that begins with, "Does anyone know how to?" Because real heroes never really retire. They just wait for their next mission. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of courage and determination, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We share amazing real-life stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every week. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of their age, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your story in the comments. And if this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear that heroes come in all ages and from all walks of life. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone overlooks. Thanks for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next story.